I am Bronwen Carroll. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a BB&N parent. I have 4 kids, and I am a pediatric emergency medicine physician at Boston Medical Center. And through the nature of my work in the ER, I have the occasion to talk to kids and families about sexual assault, sexual abuse, child trafficking, pornography, and associated topics pretty much every time I go to work. And so I'm here to talk to all of you tonight to share some thoughts about how you can talk to your kids about these topics. Speaking at that forum a few weeks ago, so I had never spoken on any of these topics in a preventative way before, and that was actually a really educational experience for me, because one of the things that I came to realize is that parents and teachers and adults who work with kids are getting shockingly little direction about how to talk to their children about these topics. So for those of you who are parents, when you became parents, did some doctor or medical professional talk to you about how babies should be put on their back to sleep to prevent SIDS? Yes, yes, this is a common thing. And then at some point, has a pediatrician spoken to you about car seats, restraining kids properly in the car? Yes. And not leaving your kid in the bathtub, drowning prevention, water safety? Yes. Okay. So just to contextualize all of these things, depending on how you're defining things, between 1,500 and 3,000 infants die in the United States of SIDS a year. 1,200 kids are killed in motor vehicle accidents. The delta on that from year to year is about 6% swing, but 1,200 is a reasonable number for a baseline, and 900 children drown a year. Okay, now, has any doctor ever spoken to you about how to talk to kids about sexual abuse? At all? Nobody. So not one person. Okay. That is astonishing. And the reason that that is astonishing is because it's estimated that 10% of children are sexually abused. So of babies born in the United States this year, it's expected that 500,000 of them will experience sexual abuse. And it's estimated that there are 42 million adult survivors of sexual abuse in the United States presently. And all of these numbers, there is total agreement that this is an underrepresentation of what's actually happening, because this is based on what's being reported. Okay, so all of this is important. Babies need to be on their backs in cribs, and kids, you're not going to want to hear this from me, but until your child is 80 pounds, they should be in a 5-point restraint. And drowning is the leading cause of death for kids between ages 1 and 4. So you should worry about all of these things. They're all important. I have a long list of other things that you should worry about. But it is an astonishing public health failure that we are not talking about sexual abuse in kids when you think about these statistics. So 1 in 5 girls and somewhere between 1 in 7 and 1 in 13 boys are sexually assaulted before they're 18. And that is really uncomfortable and unpleasant to think about. But if hearing those numbers pushes us to talk about these hard topics with kids, then I view that piece of it as a really good thing. Talking to kids about sex, talking to kids about sexual abuse, it's super uncomfortable. It's nobody's choice for how to spend their time. But I would argue that it's some of our more important work as parents. One of the hardest parts about parenting is that kids keep growing and changing. So you bring this newborn home from the hospital, and that totally rocks your world. And then maybe you start getting the hang of it, and all of a sudden you're supposed to introduce solids, and then they're crawling, and you need to child-proof your house, and you kind of get the hang of having a toddler, and then they're a preschooler, and on we go. So not only do we have to have these really difficult conversations with our kids, but we're supposed to know how to do it across the entire spectrum of child development. That's a lot. Now, clearly, I'm not going to be able to go over every conversation to have with every kid at every age tonight, but hopefully we can lay some solid groundwork. And I'm available as a resource, and we'll have time for questions at the end. I'm sure some of you have heard me say this, but I've reached a point in my career where I am impossible to surprise. I can say with a high degree of confidence that nobody in this room will even crack my top 100 list of unexpected questions. So if you're wondering something, other people are too, please don't hesitate to ask questions. So the topics that we're talking about with sexual abuse in kids, this is actually a lot of different conversations that are all interrelated, but they're separate conversations. So we need to talk to our kids about pornography. That might surprise some of you. We'll talk about the hows and whys later. We need to talk to our kids about sexual abuse and sexual predators. We need to talk to our kids about online safety. But when I say we need to talk about these things, I don't mean we need to sit down and have a chit chat on each topic and then our work is done. We need to be talking about all of these things in a pretty regular, casual way. And the reason why is because child predators use our society's baseline discomfort talking about sex, and they use shame and embarrassment to their advantage. So when you make your home a household where these words are spoken and these topics are discussed, you are actively taking a really important first step in protecting your child from victimization. Yes, you are hopefully giving your kids concrete advice. So we are going to talk about red flag behaviors that your kids should be looking for and what they need to disclose to you and how they can extricate themselves from uncomfortable conversations. But in addition to giving that concrete advice, you're also setting a broader tone. And that tone is that no topic is off limits. And so by doing that, you're opening a door for your child to come to you if something uncomfortable happens. There are really good data that kids coming out of families with strong family culture have particularly good mental health outcomes. So family culture is your family's traditions, habits, choices, beliefs, priorities, all of these things. And all families have cultures. But kids coming out of families where those cultures are sort of intentionally named and defined tend to have higher self-esteem, they tend to have higher sense of connection, and they seem to have greater life satisfaction. So if I were going to define my family's culture, I would say our family culture is grounded in the idea that your siblings are your number one priority. They are more important than your academics, they are more important than your friends, they are more important than your activities, it's more important than us. Your siblings are your most valuable resource. And then after that, I would say our family culture prioritizes cooking, we prioritize travel, reading, skiing, although my relationship with skiing now is a little iffy, the beach, and we value spending time with each other over other things, and we talk about everything. Now, your family cultures are going to be different. Maybe they're grounded in your ethnic heritage or camping or hiking or your religious beliefs. It doesn't matter. But the part of it that's important is the talking about everything part. Because if you make that part of your family culture starting now, it's going to change how you speak to your kids about all of these topics. But more importantly, it is going to change how your kids speak to you. So I want to cover a couple special populations. If you or your partner has been sexually assaulted, or if sexual abuse has touched your family in other ways, that makes having these hard conversations significantly harder. And so I would encourage you to seek outside additional support. I am happy to get people pointed in the right direction with resources there. Then the other thing that I want to mention is kids who have high anxiety at baseline, particularly anxiety around violence and crime and bad guys, because we're walking a fine line with all of our kids. On the one hand, we want our children to be aware, we want our children to be prepared. We also want them to set forth into the world and live their lives with gusto, and we don't want them paralyzed with fear that attackers are lurking around every corner. So especially with anxious kids, I think it's always helpful to focus on the helpers. And I would frame it along the lines of, I'm actually not very worried that anything bad is going to happen to you because you have so many people in your life who are looking out for you and keeping you safe. But I hope that talking about these extra skills that you can develop to know what to look out for and to know how to keep yourself safe will make you feel extra protected. So with that, I want to talk about how to have these actual conversations. I advise against formal sit-downs. It creates way too much pressure for everybody. Cars are great. You have a captive audience. You don't have to make eye contact. Walks are great for the same reason. And then Another really good thing to do is you can have these conversations while engaging in another activity, as long as it's not something that takes a ton of focus. So while you're chopping vegetables for dinner, while you're coloring, while you're doing a jigsaw puzzle, those are all really low-key, good environments to have these conversations in. And the next piece of this is to think about who's doing the talking. So there are so many conversations that you need to be having with your kids. We talked about sort of the basic little kid safety stuff. But then that changes as your kids get older, right? So we need to be talking to our kids about substance use and abuse. We need to be talking to our kids about the risk of early alcohol consumption. We need to be talking to our kids about what does a healthy romantic relationship look like. And in some families, one parent tends to take the lead in these conversations. And if that's the case, then it makes sense for that parent to take the lead on the sex conversations. But sometimes in households that include both a mother and a father, there's this idea that moms are supposed to talk to their daughters and fathers are supposed to talk to their sons about sex. And if that's in keeping with how you have every other conversation, then fine. But if it's not, I would really push back against it. And the reason why is because when you make talking about sex different and special, you are signaling to your kids that talking about sex is different and special. And that is literally the opposite of what we are trying to accomplish. We are trying to teach our kids that talking about sex is normal, is a normal part of life. And so you want to have the sex conversations be in keeping with all the other conversations that are happening in your house. Then the other thing that I would say is it is completely appropriate to acknowledge the awkwardness. Little kids don't necessarily know enough to feel awkward, and ideally if you start these conversations when they're little, that minimizes the awkwardness later on. But there's always going to be some degree of discomfort. And so I think it is completely fine to say, I realize that this may feel weird and embarrassing for you to talk about. And you can say, this feels weird and embarrassing for me too. Or if you feel comfortable, you can reassure your kids that you feel comfortable. It doesn't matter what you say, but there's value to being honest, because I can pretty much guarantee you that your kids are going to accurately read your comfort level, no matter what you claim. So you might as well state it for what it is. So the first thing that I want to talk about is sexual abuse and child predators. And if you only remember a single thing I say tonight, talk to your kids about secrets. So a secret is different than a surprise. A surprise is something where the person is going to ultimately find out, and presumably that surprise will please them. Baking daddy a cake for his birthday, that is a surprise. A secret is different. The whole point of a secret is that people are not supposed to find out ever, and presumably if they did find out, it would not please them. So adults do not ask children to keep secrets, period. The best thing about this messaging is that it is a universal truth. It is equally applicable to a kindergartner and a kid in high school. Adults do not ask kids to keep secrets, and if an adult ever asks you to keep a secret, then you should come and you should tell us about it immediately. Some secrets maybe aren't a big deal. Other secrets might be very important. It doesn't matter. We'll talk about it, we'll work through it, we'll figure that piece out together. But if an adult asks you to tell a secret, to keep a secret, that should be a red flag and should tell you that you need to talk to us immediately. Now, there can be tricky adults, and tricky adults might tell you that we will not believe you. They might say that you will get in trouble for telling your secret. They might even say that something bad will happen to you or something bad will happen to us if you tell us about your secret. And all of those statements are lies. And whenever I talk about this with kids, I use the word lie, and I use it intentionally. And the reason why is because it's a strong word. Most of us aren't going around telling kids that other people are liars. But the point is, it packs a punch. Kids remember it. This is not the time for gentle, inclusive, flowery language that gives people the benefit of the doubt. So if any adult tells you that there will be negative consequences for telling us a secret, that is a lie. You should come to us. We will believe you. We will protect you. Nothing bad will happen to you. Nothing bad will happen to us. Whatever the situation is, we will figure it out. We will fix it. We will keep you safe. And that is the single best message that you can give your kids. So I've been working in the ER for almost 20 years now. I have seen more abuse than I could even begin to count or remember. But what I can say is that every case of abuse where I have seen where the perpetrator has been known to the child has involved this talk of secrets. One of the hardest parts from a parenting perspective about keeping your kids safe is that perpetrators are overwhelmingly people who we know. So 7% of perpetrators are strangers. 59% are adults who are known to the family. So these are the neighbors, the babysitters, the coaches, the teachers, the priest, the scout leader, all the things that you hear about in the news. And then 34% of perpetrators are family members. So what this means is that nobody is safe, in the sense that sexual abuse impacts everybody. It is more evenly distributed across socioeconomic groups and other populations than other kinds of physical violence. And you can't focus on the people, you need to focus on the behaviors, which is where the secrecy part comes in. Because in every case I have ever seen, and that anybody I know has ever seen, where a child is victimized by somebody known to them, secrecy is part of the narrative that that perpetrator tells the child. Now this is a little bit like a Mad Libs, where you can fill in the details of your secrets. So sometimes it's a secret game. It's secret time, it's secret love. And sometimes it's a secret so that other kids aren't jealous that the victim is so special. And sometimes it's a secret so that parents aren't mad that the kid isn't where they said they were. It doesn't matter. If you create a household where your children know that adults telling kids to keep secrets is a hard no, then you are ahead of the game in terms of keeping your children safe. The "we will believe you" part is the most important part in discussing disclosure. The number one reason the child victims give for not disclosing is fear of not being believed. 45% of kids who disclose more than 5 years after an event transpires, which is problematic because a lot of trauma has really taken root in those 5 years. The reason that they give is fear of not being believed. So when you tell your kids, "we will believe you," and you just take that off the table, you are eliminating a huge reason to not disclose. So when my oldest child was younger, I kind of thought that we would have this conversation once, maybe we'd have some refreshers, and it wouldn't really come up other than that. But what I've subsequently learned that's really interesting is this actually comes up more than you would think. And hopefully it comes up in benign ways, but it does come up, and that's great because it gives your kids the opportunity to practice disclosing. It gives you the opportunity to practice believing them and receiving their disclosure. So an example is we were skiing over the holidays, and one evening my 8-year-old looks up and she says, sort of sheepishly, she says, "My ski instructor gave me hot chocolate today, but I'm not supposed to tell you because it's a secret." And so as soon as she says this, her two older siblings immediately sort of stiffen, and they look at each other and they look at me, and that's great because that means they know what the problem is, they know what my reaction is going to be, and they're just kind of waiting to see how this all is going to play out. So I say to my 8-year-old, "What do you think I think when you tell me that?" And she says, "I think you think that adults don't ask kids to keep secrets, and that's why I told you." Great. So then we talk about how I completely 100% believe her description of what transpired, how the hot chocolate doesn't matter. I'm so glad that she told me. And then we go on to the more advanced level. And the next level of this is we role play and we practice how next time she's going to say to the ski instructor, "Thank you so much for the hot chocolate. I am going to tell my mom though." She won't care. It doesn't matter if she does because in our family, we don't keep secrets. And so now you have just taught your child how to signal to somebody who might have ill intentions to stay away. Now, just to be clear, I don't think that our ski instructor had any ill intentions at all. I think that she and my daughter were having a fun day together. Secrets are bonding. They were having fun. Maybe they were being a little naughty with the hot chocolate, having a shared experience. Here's the problem. Child predators know that secrets are bonding too. And the way that this works isn't generally somebody meets your child, they rape them the next day, and they say, hey, let's keep that a secret. Child predators are smart. They start out small. They give your child stickers. That's what grooming is. And by the way, these people who you know, they're often not just grooming your kid, they're grooming you too. So when you have this conversation with your child, you are training them, because if somebody is grooming a kid and they get a message directly back, I'm telling my mom because our family doesn't keep secrets, you have completely flipped the tables, because a child predator hears, oh, this kid and this family, they're the wrong target, because this is a family that talks about everything, and that makes them dangerous to me because I operate based on shame and secrecy. How many of you have seen Wicked? Okay, so there's this key part of Wicked where Glinda tells Elphaba not to be afraid of the wizard. And Elphaba's response is, I'm not, the wizard should be afraid of me. And we can all harness a little bit of that Elphaba energy. Now, it's not a perfect analogy because, of course, we're all scared of something bad happening to our kids. But the point is, particularly when these conversations feel overwhelming or intimidating, we can also remember that a huge part of this is empowerment. Because with some fairly simple tools, you can turn your family into a family who predators should be afraid of. So once your kids know to talk about secrets, they know how to disclose them. We also want them to have tools if they find themselves in a situation where they feel uncomfortable, and we want to create opportunities for them to easily facilitate disclosure. So the first piece of this is that we want to teach our kid to trust their own instincts and to listen to their inner voices. And this begins when they're really little, by not forcing them to show people affection. So the days of come give Uncle Buster a great big hug need to be over. So when I meet people, I might give them a hug. I might shake their hand. I might say hi. Can you imagine if I met someone and I said hi and some adult was like, you need to go hug her? That's ridiculous, and yet we do that with kids all the time. So this can be really challenging, particularly for people who struggle setting boundaries with family. And usually that's because they don't want to hurt feelings, they don't want to offend people, they don't want to get negative reactions. And I would say I completely understand that, and you need to do it anyway. Because maybe Uncle Buster will be offended. Hopefully he gets over it. Maybe he doesn't. That's okay too. The last message that you want to be giving your kids is that they are expected to show adults physical affection on demand. Or maybe even worse, that they are expected to show other people, adults, physical affection to keep those people happy. So our 3-year-old does this thing where she will tell me that her kissing store is closed. And I make a really big thing of it. The kissing store is closed. She is not receiving kisses right now. She is not delivering kisses. And I tell her that should she ever choose to open her kissing store, I would love to be a customer. And she loves this game because it makes her feel really powerful. And that is great. Let her get the message now that she is powerful and she can determine whom she kisses and who she doesn't. We do this thing where we unintentionally tell kids that their inner voices can't be trusted or incorrect. We do this all the time, and it's well intended. So little kids fall and they cry, and the first thing we say is, "You're okay." And what we mean is, you're not seriously injured. But the kid is crying because they don't feel okay. So when I broke my leg skiing, if somebody had come up to me and said, "You're okay," and they meant you're not dying, well, yeah, that would have been factually correct. That would have also been really poorly received as I was lying in the snow on the mountain. And yet we do this to kids all the time. So a much more helpful response would be, I bet that really hurt, or I bet that felt really scary. Let's sit and I can hold you until you feel better. The other big area where people do this is around kids and fear. You especially see this with children who are afraid of dogs. So we're constantly telling our kids that their fear is irrational, which, by the way, as a pediatric ER doctor, the fear of dogs, not so irrational. But so we tell kids that their fear is irrational and maybe even acting annoyed by their fear. And then additionally, again, well-intended dog owners are constantly telling kids how friendly their dogs are. Okay, the friendliness of the dog is beside the point. Can you imagine if you had a friend who was scared of flying and you said, this plane is actually super safe? You wouldn't expect them to be like, oh, the plane is safe. I'm not scared of flying anymore. That's not how anxiety works. And we understand that with adults because it's obvious. And yet we minimize kids' anxiety and tell them that they're wrong all the time. So all of these examples are ways in which we're telling our kids not to listen to their inner voices when really we want to be doing the opposite. So when I was a pediatrics resident, I was working overnight. I was on call in a community hospital. And a pediatric surgeon who, really good doctor, excellent surgeon, I would be very comfortable having him operate on any of my kids tomorrow if that was necessary, invited me to come do a case with him. And this would have been a really good professional opportunity. It would have been a good case. He was going to let me do the whole thing. And I said no. And not only did I say no, but I made up an excuse as to why I couldn't do this. I said that there was a kid on the floor who was too sick for me to leave. And that was a pretty risky thing for me to do because it wasn't true. He could have probably figured that out. He had a lot of power. I had no power. And the reason that I did this is because I was scared to be alone with him. So operating rooms in hospitals, I didn't really know the layout of this hospital, but often they're in the basement, they're through, corridors, and hospitals tend to be pretty quiet at night. And so I didn't want to get into a situation where I was physically isolated with this man. Now here's the kicker. This man had never given me any reason whatsoever to fear him. He had never said anything strange. He'd certainly never touched me. He had never been anything other than friendly and collegial. So after all of this transpired, my inner dialogue was something like, what is wrong with you? Why would you do that? That was like stupid, that is crazy, you need to get a grip. So fast forward about a year, that surgeon became wildly inappropriate with me, and I subsequently learned was inappropriate with many women in my residency program. And then after that, ultimately, he was accused of assaulting a nurse at a conference out of state. So to this day, I can't tell you what I was responding to that night. But clearly I was responding to something, and I was apparently on to something. And I think a lot of people have these sorts of stories. Certainly a lot of women do. And so my kids know this story. And the reason that my kids know this story is because I want them to understand that listening to your instincts and your inner voice, even if you can't articulate exactly what it is you're listening to, is completely okay. I want them to know it's okay to not get in the car. It's okay to leave the party. It's okay to not accept the drink, to end the date, to decline the invitation, just because it doesn't feel right to you. That's listening to your inner voice, and we want our kids to be able to do it. Okay, so you've gotten to the point where your kids know they're supposed to listen to their inner voice. Great. So now, what do they do when they're out in the world and their inner voice is telling them that something doesn't feel right? So this is very age dependent. It's easiest with older kids. So our older kids, they don't have cell phones, but they have something that we call the kid phone, which is configured so that they can text us. And we have an understanding that if they ever send us a message that references a relative who doesn't exist, that is an SOS. So they can send me a text, hey, did Uncle Rob drop off my sneakers? Are we having dinner at Aunt Sharon's house tonight? And anybody looking over their shoulder, that's a completely benign, unremarkable text. But to me, it is an emergency evacuation text because there is no Uncle Rob and there is no Aunt Sharon. So if I receive that text, I will call them and I will say, there's a transportation issue, there's a change in plans, I'm so sorry, but I have to come get you right now, I'm on my way. So they have an established evacuation plan. With littler kids, it gets harder, and I'm gonna start with much littler kids because it actually builds on itself. So 2-year-olds can reliably learn a single phone number. A 2-year-old should know your phone number. You just practice it every day. At our house, we do it at breakfast. Our 3-year-old definitely knows my number. And the reason why is because with preschool kids and toddlers, you want them to know if they're ever lost, if you're ever out somewhere, they can't find you. They should stay put. They should look for, ideally, a mom with kids or somebody in a uniform, and they should say, I can't find my mom, this is her number. Just as an aside, if you ever can't find a little child or you're with someone who can't find a little child, the instinct is to scream the child's name. And that's not a bad thing to do. It certainly doesn't make anything worse, but it also doesn't recruit anyone to help you because your kid's name is meaningless to anyone but you. A much more useful thing to yell out is, I'm looking for a 3-year-old girl with blonde curly hair and a pink shirt. Because whether they care or whether they not, when people hear that message, everybody automatically scans. It's just how our brains work, and you might as well use it to your advantage. Your child will still recognize your voice if they can hear you. But as a general rule, little kids should know your phone number. But then you reach this mid-zone where they're old enough that they're gonna go to after-school activities maybe, or they might be at a friend's house. And they're old enough to be out in the world without you, but they're not old enough to communicate with you independently. That is the hardest age group, but again, knowing your phone number is helpful. And the reason why is because you can tell your child if they're ever uncomfortable, they should go to the adult in charge and they should say, I need to call my mom. I'm allowed to call her whenever I want. Her phone number is, and then actually say the number. And the reason why that's important is because when they recite the number, it turns us into more of a call for action that adults are likely to execute, as opposed to sort of a request where even a well-meaning adult in that situation might try, to sort of distract the kid or engage the kid. Whereas when the kid gives the number, it's sort of more, I mean business on this. The hardest part about this is if they're pushed, what reason should they give for needing to call you? The most obvious one is that they don't feel well. I kind of hate that because it sets a bad precedent, and you don't want to teach your kid that the way to get out of, whatever it is by saying that they don't feel well. But it's an option. If you use that option, I would explicitly talk to your kids about how you don't want them telling you that they don't feel well. Jen, plug your ears. But my kids sort of know that on occasion, more when they're younger, but on occasion, sometimes they might not want to go to school just because they don't want to go to school, or they might want to skip ballet, and that's okay. They don't do it very often, but I think that just knowing that that's an option that is maybe available to them helps them be more honest with me. But so one option is saying that they don't feel well. They can also say, and this tends to be authentic, is that they feel worried. Now the problem with that is that then a well-meaning adult may try to reassure them, and really you just want them to call you, not reassure them. You can also ask your kid what ideas they have. So my daughter said that she would say that her head felt itchy and she was worried she had lice. Now, I bet that is the most effective way to end a play date ever. So that is also a really good idea. Now, with all of this, obviously, you are opening yourself up to the possibility that you end up rescuing your kids from situations that don't really merit rescue. My stance on that is, I would rather unnecessarily rescue my kids 1,000 times and hopefully debrief and learn from those experiences than miss the one time when they really need to be rescued and they don't know how to get it. It is important to debrief after your kid has been away from you. And we all do that naturally anyway, right? So, you pick up your kid from practice or from school and you say, hey, how did it go? But it can also be helpful to ask questions that are maybe a little bit more specifically crafted to bring about disclosure. A question that I love asking after my kid has been away is, did you feel comfortable the entire time? And the reason that I like that question is because I actually think it's a useful question, because we all sometimes feel uncomfortable in social situations. We feel awkward, we don't know what to say. And so it's great to normalize that feeling with your kids and to talk through those situations. But that question is also a really nice entrance to if something beyond typical growing pains has transpired that makes your kid feel uncomfortable. And then there are all kinds of other questions. Now, obviously, I don't ask all of these questions every time, but it's useful to have some questions that you can ask if maybe your child seems a little quiet, a little withdrawn. You know, you have an inner voice too. And so if something feels off to you after a situation, questions that you can ask are, was anybody unexpected where you were? Did you meet anybody new? Does your new teacher, coach, physical therapist have you do anything that other teachers haven't had you do before? A great question with little kids is, did you play any games that you haven't heard of before? And so these are sort of conversation starters with your kids, particularly if you ever have concern. I also think after all of these conversations, all of these debriefs, it is great to get feedback from your kids, in part to understand the messaging that they're actually receiving. Are they internalizing what you are trying to communicate? And also how they think you're doing. So I think that soliciting feedback from your kids is a really excellent and highly underutilized parenting tool. So most of us do 360-degree feedback at work, and most of us would agree that parenting is our most important job. So why not get feedback from your kids? I say to my kids pretty regularly, I ask them, what do they think I'm doing well? What do they think I'm not doing well? My son has shared that I am particularly weak, I think he said below average, in engagement around sledding and swimming in the ocean. And that feedback is 100% accurate and true. And so I think it's great to say to your kids, hey, what did you think about our conversation about adults keeping secrets yesterday? What did you take away from that? What did you think I explained well? What did you think I could have done differently? After I gave my last talk, I got a lot of feedback initially, but then I got this second wave of feedback. And the second wave of feedback was people saying things that they had left my talk and they'd spoken to their kids or had a conversation with their kids. And a lot of times they were sort of beating themselves up that maybe it didn't go as smoothly as they liked, or they had said that they felt like I would have done a better job. And what I would say is, if you leave here and you have a conversation with your kids, you are already way ahead of the curve. And yes, it would probably be easier for me than for your average person, because I've pretty much been talking to kids about sex for my entire adult life. And yet, despite that, I still really don't like having these conversations with my own kids. Some of you might feel that you would rather I talk to your kids about sex, but the funny part is I would also rather talk to your kids about sex. But these conversations, it's like any other skill set in that you will get better with practice, and feedback can help you. So secrecy, talking about secrecy is the best way to protect your kids from assailants who they know. In terms of protecting your kids from strangers, the simple message is adults don't ask children who they don't know for help. Adults do not need your help moving something. They don't need your help solving a problem. They don't need to borrow your phone. And if an adult who you don't know asks you for help, you say no, you say it loudly, you draw as much attention to yourself as you can, and then you get out of that situation. Kids need role play and kids need practice, and no person and no situation gets a free pass. So kids need to know that they are free to leave any situation in which they don't feel comfortable, and you practice it so that they have established exit strategies. And so we go through this. What are you going to say? What are you going to do? And you do it for different scenarios. Pretend I'm grandpa. Pretend I'm your dance teacher. Pretend I'm so-and-so's mom. What are you going to say? This practice is exactly why schools have fire drills. Schools have lockdown drills. The flight attendant tells you what to do with the oxygen mask, because we all need preparation to deal with situations that come up that might not be expected. So then the next thing that we need to talk to our children about is pornography. As kids get older, and probably not as old as many of us think, the numbers on pornography and the likelihood of children being exposed to it are staggering. So I'm gonna go out on a limb here. Different families make different choices. All of it is fine, but I will be a lone voice, and I will tell you that your kids don't necessarily need smartphones and iPads. There's a whole list of reasons why, and it wouldn't even be at the very top of my list. But I would say is that the less time your kids spend with screens, the less content they're exposed to. It's estimated that 1 in 5 kids is going to be sexually solicited online. But particularly as your children get older, work shifts online, they're going to need to have some online presence. And so it's important for them to understand what pornography is, why it concerns you. And once again, to open that door to have the conversation and to make it something that your household names and discusses. Because if your child sees pornography, and this has never been mentioned in your home in any way, shape, or form, I would argue that it makes it really difficult, if not impossible, for your child to raise that with you. And if your child is able to do that, kudos to them, but then you've created a situation where they are parenting you, and that is not the goal. So it is important for your kids to know that pornography exists, and that even if they're not trying to find pornography, they may stumble upon it online. Also, curiosity is completely natural and normal. So kids may be curious about sex, and they may look at pornography for that reason, or they may have a friend who shows it to them. But all of that is likely to be more confusing and more upsetting than it would be at baseline if they don't even know what that is. There are a lot of problems with pornography. One thing that I've discussed with our older son is the question of who is producing pornography, what is their motivation, who is in the pornography, and what is their motivation, because that is a great way to broaden conversations around coercion and consent. But just at baseline, pornography is a problem because it isn't real. And so it gives kids, and adults actually, completely unrealistic expectations about sex and about bodies. So if you are a teenager or you are a young adult and you are expecting sexual experiences to somehow resemble pornography, you are definitely going to be very disappointed. Additionally, if you are getting your information about sex from pornography, then it is likely that you're going to end up with some off-base ideas. So an example of this is that in recent years, asphyxiation has gained a lot of traction online as being part of sex. And I've had multiple cases in the ER where young people have come in where teenage girls, in the context of consensual sexual encounters, have been unexpectedly strangled. And in these cases, these young men have really seemed to not be intending harm and have been genuinely surprised that strangulation was not well received, and have been genuinely surprised by my news flash that approximately 0% of teenage girls are looking to be strangled. But I don't have the sense that these kids were in any way bad kids or deviant kids. I think genuinely they were emulating what they had seen. And so it is so important for you to explain to your kids that pornography is not a real-life depiction of sex in the same way that action movies are not a real-life depiction of driving. But there's a super important distinction. And the distinction is that your kids have reference points with driving. Your kids know that action movies don't represent real-life driving because you drive them to school and they see that cars aren't jumping over each other and exploding. Your kids don't have those reference points with sex. So they don't know how to contextualize pornography unless you talk about it. discussing pornography is a great segue into talking about online safety generally. So your kids should know that they should not send any content, words or images, via email, via text, via Snapchat, via anything, that they do not want a screenshot of that printed out, distributed to their entire school, their entire family, their future employers, and basically everyone they've ever met in their entire lives. That is a pretty good way to sum it up. Additionally, kids have no reason to be talking to anyone online, and if they are talking to people online, their baseline assumption should be that everyone is a middle-aged man with mental illness who's messaging them from a prison library computer. Your kids have no reason to talk to people online. That should be crystal clear. And then additionally, should they choose to ignore that part of the statement, if they are talking to people online, they have no reason to believe anything that anybody says. Child pornography is a whole other kettle of fish. I hadn't spoken to my kids about it until pretty recently. And my kids have a higher level of knowledge about all sorts of salacious topics than your average kid, and they were pretty taken aback by child pornography. What I said to them is that some people have problems in their heads. It's like a form of mental illness. And for reasons that we don't understand, their brains aren't working properly. And their brains aren't working properly in a way that makes them interested in looking at pictures of kids, maybe with no clothes on, maybe with grown-up clothes, maybe engaging in grown-up activities. And I acknowledge that it is really creepy and really uncomfortable, but that it's something that they need to know about. The reason that they need to know about this is because the quantity of child pornography out there is staggering. It is very difficult for most of us to understand. It is hundreds of millions of downloads, which demands the question, who is doing all of these downloads? Probably to some extent, it's people we know. And so your kids need to understand that this is out there, and you can just acknowledge how distressing it is to think about. My daughter asked me who the kids are, which was a question that I should have seen coming, but I didn't. It definitely caught me off guard. And I will say, whenever you are caught off guard, going back to the helpers is always a good way to regain some more solid footing, and also to tell the truth. And so I told her the truth. I said, we don't know. There are a lot of people, a lot of helpers whose job it is to try to identify these kids and help keep them safe. And that is a good segue into my last point, which is that if your child comes at you with a question that you're not prepared to answer, it is completely okay to say, wow, that is a really good question, and I'm going to need to take a minute to think about that. Or even to say, that's a really good question, and I'm going to need to do a little bit of research as to how we should talk about that and get back to you. The important part is that then you need to do the work. Even if the work is emailing me, that's fine, but you need to do some kind of work and then get back to them. I don't think that there are many sort of ironclad rules for anything, but I might say that an ironclad rule for parenting is if your kids are brave enough to ask you a question, you need to be brave enough to answer. And that, I hope that was helpful, and I'm open for questions if anybody has them.
Okay, so my name is Narayan. So you spoke about social media. So if there is content in social media that you disapprove of, it doesn't need to be pornographic. It is just content that actually divulges privacy things.
Sure.
Are there services that scrub social media?
There are.
I've heard of one called Take It Down. Have you heard of it?
So, no, I am not specifically an expert in this. I think that the school has resources on this, and there are lots of online resources. There are definitely ways that you can try to filter what your kids are seeing. I also think that it is important for us to understand that we are not going to be able to control what our kids are seeing, no matter how hard they try, because we're not going to be able, to filter every device they come into contact with. We're not going to be able to filter their friends. And so yes, I certainly think that there are all kinds of safety measures that you can and should put on devices, but those don't change the necessity of talking about everything that I talked about.
Thank you for this talk. It was very insightful, very helpful. It was one of those things where we have so many conversations with our kids or with adults about all sorts of things, how to drive and whatnot, but we don't have this kind of conversation with our kids. It's very, very helpful. Thank you for that. You talked about trying to remove a child from a situation where they're within distance, where they're at a friend's party or something. But what happens if they're on a school trip or if they're traveling? Then how do you help them, and what kind of tools and guidelines can you give them when they are in a situation where you cannot immediately move them from where they are?
Yeah. I think for all of these scenarios, whatever they are, it doesn't matter as much what answer you pick. It's that you and your child formulate a plan together. And so it depends on the context. Maybe it's that there is somebody else who would be on that trip who they would feel comfortable going to. Maybe it's the same strategy that they use, that they just demand to call you, and in advance if they're calling you, there is a real problem. I think that the best thing that you can do is just to make sure that your kids have prearranged and practiced escape routes, and what that escape route is just going to have to be determined by the situation.
I have a question just in the context of having a younger kid at the lower school and then having to talk to him about Mr. DeWitt. What happens if you were like an unprepared parent like me and you're operating you're now hopping on a moving treadmill? Do you start with the topics that you're talking about? Do you start with child pornography? Do you start with sex and move up to child pornography? What order do you go in? Do you throw all of it at once when you have a crisis like this?
Sure.
How do you play catch up?
Right. And I think that it's really easy to get hung up on what is the right way to do this. There isn't a right way to do this. And you kind of, again, it's listening to your own inner voice, right? So if your kid doesn't know where babies come from, then I probably wouldn't jump into porn. And so you need to start with the basics and work your way up. But your point is right, and the Mr. DeWitt thing is a great example. It caught a lot of us off guard. But I think that what that teaches us is that ideally, you want to be ahead of these things. And so the more that you can cover earlier before you're forced to cover it, the better. And then for the things that you haven't covered, if you unexpectedly get backed into a corner, you do the best you can. Just by having a conversation, any conversation, that is the most important part, because it isn't even so much the specifics of what you're conveying to your kids. It's setting the tone that we can talk about things, and then you can take your lead from them. Because once you've established an open door and you have made yourself a household where topics aren't off limits, you can take your lead from where your kids take you.
So if you're talking to your child about a topic that maybe other families aren't talking about yet, do you ever tell your child, like, hey, this is for our family to discuss. This doesn't mean you go on the bus ride tomorrow and say, this is what porn is, or this is how babies are made. Do you include that, or do you want them to actually, I mean, probably not, but turn to their buddies on the bus and say, hey, this is what porn is, so that it becomes less shamed?
So this has been a big issue in my house. When our now 8-year-old was in kindergarten, at pickup one day, I got informed very politely, but that she had explained to all of kindergarten why Eastern Massachusetts doesn't have meth labs. And not surprisingly, the rest of kindergarten was a little slow to catch on as to what she was talking about. By the way, the answer is because meth labs, you need a lot of wide open space. So that's out west. They smell really bad. They're hard to have in cities. I can't really tell you why my kids know that, but somehow it came up. So I think it's a balance. Because again, we don't want any of this to be, we're trying to avoid secrecy and shame, right? But I also think that you can tell your kids, honestly, my kids definitely know that other families probably aren't having the exact conversations that we're having, and that some, right, no, and you know what, honestly, you probably don't need to. And that different parents have different comfort levels. So my kids know that there are lots of adults who aren't comfortable talking about lots of these things. And so I think that you can share with your kids that different families, so my mantra is different families have different roles. That pretty much covers every topic of all of parenting. But that different families talk about these things in different ways, and that they should absolutely feel free to talk about what feels right for them, but that they need to understand that their peers may not be talking about all of these topics. And the way that I would lead is that we don't want to make other people feel afraid or uncomfortable. And so we don't necessarily want to talk to kids about topics that might scare them. That's really more their parents' job.
Do you have suggestions about how to talk with kids about keeping their friends' secrets or other kids' secrets, even when those secrets might be about harmful things?
Yeah, so, you know, obviously there are different kinds of secrets, and I would just have that conversation explicitly. So if your friend's secret is that she, you know, has a candy stash under her bed or something, although actually I was going to say something that isn't going to hurt her, and then my ER doctor, I'm like, oh my God, she could choke. But generally speaking, if it's something that isn't going to hurt her or another child, or she isn't being hurt, then you can tell your child to use your judgment. I think the more important message is that if a child shares a secret with you about they themselves being hurt, or another person being hurt, or a secret about something dangerous, knowing where their dad's gun is would be a great example, or having matches, that then your child has an obligation to share that at least with you, and that you can work out together what is a way that will both protect your child from getting in trouble for disclosing a secret, but also protect that other child, is how I would approach it.
For children, as an educator, for children with either disabilities or children with very high anxiety or something that might be disabling them from either talking to you or wanting to express their angst about something, or even you talking to them. I know you talk a lot about helpers and things like that, but do you have any suggestions on kids with very high anxiety, like levels that even if you're just addressing something very mundane that you think is mundane, what is your suggestion on that?
So I think that's really hard, because kids with the kind of anxiety that you're talking about are going to be anxious no matter what you do. But I actually think that that unfortunate truth should make you feel better, because they are going to feel anxious no matter what you do. And so you can more think about it as you are providing them with information. You're not going to make their anxiety better, but at that level of anxiety, you're also probably not making it significantly worse. And if you want to try to minimize the anxiety, I think focusing on empowerment for the child themselves is your best bet. That this is a magic power for them. This is their secret trick to help ward off all of the spirits that are making them anxious.
Can you kind of elaborate on the concept of helpers? So when you talk about helpers, do you put a certain individuals in a group of people that would be helpers for your child, like caregivers? Because I thought because we don't want familiar and non-familiar to be.
No, definitely not. So I do not make any distinction for any people at all, because the whole point is that we have no idea. Nobody is safe. Nobody is trusted. You just don't know. And that's why the helpful thing to do is to focus on the behavior. It doesn't matter who the person is. Secrets don't work. It doesn't matter who the person is. If your inner voice tells you that a situation feels not good, then the situation feels not good. When I talk about helpers, I more mean in a much broader sense that the world has more good than bad, and there are lots of sort of generic helpers, doctors and teachers and police officers and firemen, and all of these people who are working together to presumably make the world safe and a better place. But I think that is a super important point, that no person is exempt from everything that we talked about.
And then you use the concept of helpers in, like, there are people who would help you in certain scenarios. How can you give me one example of?
Yeah. So my example would be in trying, my daughter was really freaked out by this idea of who are these children featured in child pornography. And so I created the idea of helpers loosely. Who are they? I mean, I guess they're FBI agents and people like that who work in cybersecurity and the people who are tracking down Mr. DeWitt, right? But I use it as a general term. There are all of these helpers who are trying to take child pornography down and to identify the people downloading it and to identify the people creating it and to find the kids who, are being live streamed from Thailand. And I know, sorry. And so it's more of a generic term that I use to try to reassure kids that there are lots of people in the world whose jobs are, in all sorts of different ways, to keep them safe. It is sort of like a blanket reassurance that the world has a lot of good.
Quick question. I was just thinking that I think you've encouraged us to be brave and to kind of wade into uncomfortable spaces. I was wondering, are there good children's books or ways to engage in storytelling that is memorable for them? So, for example, if you lose a pet or you lose a family member, there are beautiful books that help you sort of work through those concepts with kids. And I think a lot of people here probably have The Invisible String as a book, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
So I would love to know if they exist. And if they don't, it's a great business idea for you. You should get into that space.
Start writing.
So my answer is, I don't know. I guess they exist. I would be shocked if they don't exist. In terms of figuring out what they are, besides the obvious, so the CAC, which is the Children's Advocacy Center, which I think that I thought that's just what we called it in Boston, but I think it happened. They have them everywhere. Basically, so when children disclose sexual abuse, what ultimately happens is they get sent to the CAC. Not for like immediate forensic exams, but for forensic interviews, and also to work through that trauma. My guess is that if we looked at the CAC websites, they would have recommended resources like that, because all that they do is work with traumatized kids and talk about abuse. Let me circle back to you. It's a really good question. I should know the answer, and I don't, so I will let you know. I'll see what I find
figured
out.
it's a easy way bedtime story. It kind of just broaches the topic, and someone's creative enough to make it very accessible, I'm sure.
Sure, I'm sure.